Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to this learning experience brought to you by CloudBees. My name is Cody, and welcome back to Techstrong Learning, where we have an exciting panel ahead. Before we get that ball rolling, I do have just a couple of housekeeping notes I'd like to review with everyone. First of all, today's session is being recorded. So if you miss any of our discussion, if you'd like to rewatch at a later time, or if you'd like to share with your team, you will be receiving an email with a link to access the on-demand recording shortly after we conclude this live session today. Now, if you'd like to engage with our panel, there are a couple of ways for you to do so. The first and the easiest option is the chat tab, which can be found on the right side of the screen. So I'm seeing Nigeria, Delta State, I'm seeing Salzburg, Texas. We've got people from all over the world. So let us know from where in the world you are joining us from. If you have any specific questions, we do want you to send those into our Q&A, as sending your questions into the Q&A just helps us keep track, and we'd like to answer as many of your questions today as we can. Additionally, before we close things out today, we are giving away 4 $25 Amazon gift cards, so be sure to stick around to find out if you're one of our lucky winners today. So our topic is security, compliance, and risk management in the SDLC. And I'm joined today by Gayatri Prakash, VP and GM of Compliance at CloudBees, Ken Muse, Senior DevOps Architect at GitHub, and Tracy Bannon, Software Architect and Digital Transformation Advisor at the Meter Corporation. So Tracy, Ken, and Gayatri, thank you all so much for joining me today. Gayatri, I have a question for you to get this conversation rolling. So tell me, what is DevSecOps and what are the goals for it? Additionally, where are we today with most large enterprises?
Right, that's my favorite topic, Cody. So the premise for DevSecOps, right, was the world moved from Agile to DevOps, where development and ops sprinting along together, common objectives. The idea behind DevSecOps was to introduce security into that. So security stays lockstep with dev and ops, and it's not an afterthought, right? So right from the beginning, it's security first mindset. That's what that was the kind of objective mantra, if you like, DevSecOps. But I think the reality as to where we have ended up is a little bit of lots and lots of scanners deployed right at the beginning, tons of noise generated for the developers coming from all sorts of disparate sources. By the time you've added infrastructure, code, binary, most companies have double-digit number of scanners. Most teams have double-digit number of scanners. So you've got all of this coming at you as a developer. You're there to design cool features, and suddenly you're faced with, I've got 65 CVEs to fix if I've got to go live, right? That's not the developer's idea of fun. It's essential, but is it the right use of people's time, and is it the right way to implement security? What do we need to get to a better place, right? Because if you think about it, what is DevSecOps for? The overriding objective of DevSecOps is to help organization improve their security posture trend over time, right? That's the ultimate goal. Just by deploying a bunch of tech, if we could all be achieving maturity in DevSecOps, then we'll all be there by now, right? So that's the problem statement right now, is we've interpreted shift left in a way where we think deploying tech right from the scanning tools right from development environment, or even more left from their IDEs, will solve the problem of security posture, right? And so that's kind of my take on why the shift left interpretation of DevSecOps isn't really delivering on the promise. I'd like to hear your thoughts on it, Tracy.
I say as I try and make sure that I'm muting and unmuting correctly so you don't hear any background noise. It's interesting to me that when I first heard the term DevSecOps, it actually made me very frustrated. And you'd be, why? Why in the world would that make you frustrated? Because as a software architect and engineer, my focus for decades has been making sure that the quality of the software is the highest that it can be. And security has always been part of that mix. So when we started to focus on adding another phoneme, on adding sec, I kind of pushed back at first because I believed that in most of the organizations that I helped, it was already a part. What I discovered is that we need to say the word sec for a couple of reasons. One is so that people actually do remember to focus, and that perhaps the organizations I was working with, or the type of software that I was working with, the domain was more indicative of needing security by design, security by default, security from the very beginning. Why are we still pushing at this? Well, we do need to get to a point where we are de-risking. So for me, DevSecOps is about reducing risk. Just like agility is about reducing risk, DevOps is about reducing risk by taking things down to their smallest size and making sure that they are as high quality, repeatable, compliant as they can be. We haven't been able to get there yet. There are many, many, many reasons why we haven't been able to get there. And I know that we have some more questions and topics back and forth on this. One of the biggest issues is actually getting to the less about the tools and more about the culture. What I've encountered is that we say shift left and we say, okay, development team, delivery team, go ahead and do this, go get after this. And we've created a situation where there is cognitive overload because development teams don't have the skill sets necessary to be the security pros. And so somehow we believe that everybody is going to be an expert at everything. We haven't really broken down silos. We've kind of tried to shift things, shift it left, not by starting as early as possible, but by handing it off to a group that might not be the best to accomplish all of these things. So I'm gonna pause there, though.
That's very true. Yeah, I totally agree with the fact that we are asking our developers to be security experts by the approach that most enterprises are following. I would like to hear your thoughts on this as well, Ken. So I'm sorry, it's a really hot day in London today, and I'm sweating in my office. What do you think, and what's your thoughts on it?
I think that Tracy makes some great points, especially about the fact that whereas with DevOps, we try to start with the people in the process, the culture. The minute we remind people that security is in there, we throw DevSecOps and throw sec in, immediately they think tooling. The focus becomes, how can I get checkboxes? How can I get better coverage with tools? We forget about the people, that understanding security starts both at the top with support and buy-in from leadership, and at the bottom, if you don't have education and continuous improvement, one of those core tenets of DevOps, how can you hope to continuously improve your security posture? Instead, it becomes a routine, and routines are something that are easily ignored. And so it has to be a holistic approach, not a siloed approach where I've got my dev team, my DevOps team that does the deployment, my security team that reviews the security, my compliance team that makes sure that we're compliant and all the other teams did their job. We're one team working together to support our customers.
To deliver secure code and provide that visibility of the bottom line risk, right? Because no team can fix every problem that a security scanner throws up.
Well, but I want to add on to that, if you don't mind. We are still going to have security specialists. We're going to have infrastructure specialists. We're going to have those who are operating our engineering platforms. Sometimes we call them the DevOps teams. We're still going to have those who are more focused on the code, the initial code delivery. People will have their specialities. They will have affinities. So it doesn't mean everybody has to do everything. To your point, Ken, it's about making sure that if we're actually shifting left, we're bringing those people together. When we are getting our initial requirements and building out epics and user stories, we should be adding to that by having the security folks there and asking some additional questions. As a X, Mad Lib, I want to Y so I can Z. And you add on, tag on, so that I can protect myself from what? And so by adding those things, having the security team as a part of it, there is cross-pollination. There's just a beautiful exchange that can happen, but it's all about the people. I want to say the tools are the easy part. They're the fun part. They're the sprinkles on the ice cream, right?
I think some of those points you've made are perfectly valid. But I think when it comes to compliance, right, when you have to demonstrate outcomes like, did you have a threat modeling? Did you have an architectural assessment? Did you have a SAS scan? Did you have a DAS scan? It's inevitable that people get into that checkboxing exercise to say, yeah, I have a SAS scan running in the pipeline. But did it really run though? Or did you have a developer who went and commented out that step because the build took too long, right? We've all been there. So I think that's the external, because internally you can have all your cyber control framework, but when it comes to demonstrating that your security posture is functional, you need the compliance aspect, because that's what gives your consumers the confidence, if you like, that you are taking care of security. And that, I think, in turn, makes this whole exercise a tick boxing exercise. So what are your thoughts on bringing together compliance and security to the point where it is enablement, like you said, right from the beginning? Why do we do threat modeling? Threat modeling is done so that your design is informed when it comes to the API and the front end and how it communicates to the back end and all the other microservices. If you have done threat modeling, you would be designing it for scale, designing it for all kinds of, your threat landscape that's relevant to you. I think the balance, that kind of giving people the context, but also then making sure they can do all of that within the time frame they're allocated, because people are under pressure to deliver new features, cool new stuff to stay competitive. How can we get to the point where these attestations that are required to demonstrate a resilient cyber strategy or cyber control framework actually leads to enablement as opposed to tick boxing exercise under pressure? Because the auditor is here and I need to give this attestation to the auditor.
And do you want to take that one?
Oh, sure. I think part of it really begins with trying to understand what you're doing as a team to pull all that together. It has to be a holistic end-to-end practice.
Yeah.
And it really needs to start with two big things. Training. Do they understand what's even being asked of them? Otherwise, they're going to blindly start hitting check boxes and attesting to things that may not be accurate.
Yeah.
And then proper expectation setting. If you want this new feature done in 2 days, no matter what, and it has to ship, then you may be asking me to forego adequate quality control and adequate security if I haven't been properly set up to be able to achieve all of those goals. If, as a developer, I don't feel comfortable saying, wait a minute, I can have it out, but the right level of quality will take 4 days or 2 weeks to get there, or we need to do it iteratively, a little bit at a time. If I'm not empowered and supported to do that, well, then it just, again, comes back to it's a checklist, it's security theater. I'm attesting to things that may not be actually accurate, and I'm not able to then automate things in a way that gives tangible results. I'm automating for the sake of saying I automated.
Yeah. I like the word security theater. I'm going to use it. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say that on top of that, there's a theme that I hope that the audience is picking up on, and that is that it's people first. And the tools are excellent, but it's people first. It is leadership, strong leadership that truly understands. It cannot be a simple mandate that you'll do something quickly, right? If we are going to forego quality, then the risk has to be owned by that leadership, not by the developer who's afraid to raise their hand. And the second part that you've foot stomped on, Ken, is continuous upskilling, continuous exposure. In the past, we hired folks who had all of the skills that they needed, and they'd have them and they would fine tune them as they go. We are now at the point where every 6 to 12 months, we have to do some additional reintroduction, perhaps new tools. We have to revisit some of the things that we've already done. So we actually have to add that into our estimates. If we are not adding into our overall team estimate, this is the amount of education that we're needed, not 40 hours a week for every person, but this is the amount per quarter. This is how we're going to approach it. If we don't do that, all of these other things will start to fall along the wayside again, because there will be too much cognitive overload, too much for people to do, and they will be raising their hands and people will be ignoring them. And it will get to a frustration point. When people are frustrated and unmotivated, that's where even more security problems come into play.
See, I take your point on the people side, Tracy, but I think there is a long way to go on the tooling front as well. I mean, let's just take one application, right? Typical application, you're going to need an infrastructure account, whether that's AWS, GCP, Azure, whatever that might be. You're going to need source code, some kind of source code management. You're going to need an artifactory. You're going to have binary code and infrastructure assets that you're going to keep an eye on. You might have designed for all of the best security in mind. However, as you change this code, your security posture is changing, right? Vulnerabilities that the scanners are aware of is also constantly changing. So essentially, so let's take an example of a team that's using SonarQube, Black Duck for SCA, and AWS Inspector for vulnerability scanning, and maybe JFrog X-Ray for binary container analysis. All of this is coming across as different streams of input. And you as a developer, you're midstream in your sprint, right? You would have taken care of the security considerations that's come from threat modeling and architectural design conversations. But how do you make it easy? This is where I think the role of tooling comes into play. How do we bring all of this together, but then put it in context of the application and the environment? If the application is used by one man and a dog, that CVE can wait until next month. But if the application is a public facing, serving terabytes of data, confidential data, PII, that requires attention, immediate attention. Again, in terms of that kind of, or take some other way of prioritizing it, but prioritize the issues based on the impact. That's where I think the tooling comes in, is bring all of this noise together and extract a bit of signal to provide insight at an application level. I think that's where the industry needs to go, is provide that.
I agree wholeheartedly that that's where we need to go. It's not a binary decision, people or tools. But if I look at where I need to focus, I can tell you from decades of experience, and as recently as this morning, that if you focus on the tools before you focus on the people, if you're not bringing the humans along on the journey, then it doesn't matter how wonderful or how well engineered your DevOps platform is. Your entire tool chain can be very sweet and elegant and capable, and people are not able to leverage it. So it's a balance. It's just like architecture. It's all about the trade-offs and understanding the risk and where do we need to focus. Because even with DevSecOps, if somebody is coming to me and say, how do I start to implement this? I don't say do it all at once. I look at where they are on their journey and identify where are the biggest risks, and let's go after those. Let's go after that area first, so that we can build up to that repeatability. We can build up to that compliance. We can build up to that repeatable automation that we truly want.
So speaking of repeatable automation, again, we don't want to promote one tooling over another here, but can we help our viewers with some tooling choices there? How do we bring together all of the security signals from your SDLC and help you get a real-time posture of risk, real-time security posture, and real-time visibility of the residual risk? Because let's face it, it doesn't matter what your go-live thresholds are. There will always be some risks people are accepting. Maybe it's because an upstream package has not released a fix yet, and the CVE is saying that package is vulnerable. So someone somewhere has got to accept that risk and release it, right? So what tooling exists today that can give that real-time insight, do you think? What choices can you think of?
there's a lot of vendors that provide a lot of tooling to provide a lot of insight. But I would kind of adjust that just a bit, because insight without action is noise.
Mm-hmm.
Just the other day, I saw a team that had one of everything integrated together. And they had a beautiful tool. They had a nice dashboard, lots of checklists. They had completed the OS top 10, PCI DSS, things that you can't actually automate away entirely, that require a process behind it. They were getting noise that they thought was security.
Right.
And similarly, lots of packages coming to a dashboard telling them, hey, all of these are insecure. But it's only 100 and they're all low severity.
Right.
But when you stack 100 low severity together, each time you add one new one, the severity goes up, because now there's an exponential increase in the paths to exploit. So 100 lows, I would argue they had multiple criticals they just hadn't caught yet. And so I would say that with the tools, it's important to make sure that you're able to get actionable info, not just info.
So
Not the volume. I'm sorry.
Yeah, sorry. I was just going to jump on one point that Ken said. That's absolutely right. But again, there are solutions that will help you set those thresholds. And, you could leverage an OPA rule, for example. You're absolutely right about the actionable insight side. There's no insight has to be tied with a feedback loop of who is doing what with that insight, right? So the automation doesn't stop with just providing insight, but you would need to monitor the remediation rate and, is it within SLA? How is it trending? All of that good stuff. Are there systemic problems resurfacing?
Mm-hmm.
That could point back to the people part that Tracy mentioned, right? It is people process technology. But can we help our viewers with some suggestions on or any further suggestion on that end-to-end automation, from signal through to feedback to the measurement of the efficacy of the action, not just the action, right?
So I'm not sure if we want to offer up an actual tool chain. There are plenty of tool chains. If we think about the SDLC, and I don't like the figure 8 because there's a lot of falseness with the infinity loop. But to take that and stretch that out, the types of things that have to happen are pretty consistent. You mentioned these before from a capability perspective. I have to actually start with intake and visioning, right? I have to understand what's coming into the funnel, into the pipeline. And I mean the work pipeline, not the automated end pipeline. I need to understand that. So what does that look like? And who's managing that? What tools are they using? Is it a Jira? Is it an Atlassian, one of the trail? What are you using to ferret out what your intake is? What are your architectural tools? Models matter. Especially for the size and scope of the types of things that I work on. For me personally, without having core centralized models, I'm in quite a pickle, especially if we're doing what-if modeling and trying to figure out what the upstream and downstream impacts of something could be. Marching across, when I get to design, right, I have IDEs that are involved. My developers are going to be doing automated testing. What does code coverage look like? What's appropriate for your organization? Setting some I don't want to say some targets for unit testing, because there's a code coverage is a vanity metric, but just keep marching across the SDLC. Am I allowing my developers to do any kind of SAS scanning themselves? Can they do static scanning, security scanning? I was in a situation where my development team was not allowed to run that. It was a licensing thing. They had bought them for the security team, not for the development team. And all we wanted to do is give them the ability to check it out themselves, right? The closer to the defect, the closer to the origin, the faster it gets fixed. Yeah. To your point, what other tools as we go across? And we can march across, right, the entire SDLC and the whole way out into fielded production, and then have the continuous monitoring, right, Conmon, out in our production environment. SAST, DAST, IAS, there are a tremendous number of different types of real-time scanning that we want to do, static scanning that we want to do, threat modeling. I mean, we're talking about a universe. And I keep coming back to something Ken said. We need to pick where we're going to focus to start. And an organization can't start by doing everything. So what's the biggest risk that you have right now? Is it that you have truly have 75 CVEs, maybe using Microsoft's products, and you had to go through patch Tuesday, and I think it was 73 for this last patch. Is that where your biggest risk area is? You also have to think about metrics as well. Metrics can be good if they're not weaponized, if you're not aiming at one another. But looking at measurements that can help you tell quality, especially security quality, is pretty important. And that's a place where I don't think people double down. They look at DORA metrics, right? They need mean time to recover, and somebody else will throw in their velocity, and we have to turn our nose up at that one. But what are those security metrics that we should be thinking about? And I think that will help us, as opposed to the tools. It kind of helps us get after, time to detect an issue. That's a production one. People might not like that. How about your actual security vulnerabilities that are found? What are the scanning results that you're finding, right? Or frequency of security scans. That's actually not a bad measurement to help you understand where there's variation. So I'm trying to answer a really giant question, really simply, but it's massive.
I think it starts with having the right process in place first, like you say, and it will not be one size fits all. And then something that sits outside of your SDLC, but has got hooks into your SDLC from left to the right. And it's building a picture as your artifact starts from day one, first line of design, through to its entire life cycle as it gets through the SDLC. And giving you that radar, that real-time metric, or effectiveness metric, if you like, not just of have I got scan running, but what is my residual risk from this service that I've just changed? How many issues have been risk accepted? Did we remediate 70% of the issues? And like you say, you can set application or service specific thresholds, but it needs that level of interface all the way across from left to right in your SDLC. So it is a giant question, and I think it's a giant problem, but it's a problem that 100% needs solving, because I think we don't have something that brings it all together. And it has to be outside the pipeline, because if it's in the pipeline, there is a risk that it can be amended or taken out by developers. One question I have for you guys: what are your thoughts about that?
I think it's both. I don't think it belongs outside the pipeline entirely. I believe that it's much like having, I call it ad hoc testing or expert testing. I want there ultimately to be somebody sitting on the side doing things a little bit differently, and that we might not have automated in quite the right way. I still find dramatic value in that. The same thing with the pipeline. I think that as much as we can automate and continuously test and continuously evaluate, that's great. But I don't think we take the humans out of the mix. One way that we can get after solving this whole thing is for organizations to just take a step back for a moment, take an afternoon together, bring your teams together, and figure out how you are going to approach what I call the SSDF, right? This is from NIST, and this is the Secure Software Development Framework. Yeah. It's what and why and not how, but it really charges people to think about their organization, about how they're going to divide labor, about how they're going to do the different practices, right, that they need to incorporate. That might be a solid way to start, is just having an afternoon, assessing yourself against that, because you might find that you have some gaps, but you also have some real goodness that's already in place. Ken, are you familiar with the NIST?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And I love what you were just saying. And to kind of extend that just a bit, having those kind of discussions means also starting to identify your blind spots. Where do we not know what we don't know? Where do we not have the expertise? It's wonderful that you've got all 200 developers on board. But if you've got nobody with a security background that can help them learn to identify those risks, that residual risk that you mentioned is growing and no one knows it's there because no one knows what they're looking for.
Yeah.
And so I think part of it, to Tracy's point, is about the process. It's in the process. It covers everything because it really has to bring the people together to come up with that holistic strategy. And then for everything you can repeat, everything that you would do it the same way each time, things where you can pull in automated learning, machine learning, and AI. Those are great things to put in a pipeline because then you eliminate mistakes. If it's doing it the same way every time, less room to introduce error there. But to Tracy's point, it doesn't rule out any of the other people parts of your process that
I
are needed.
think that ultimately that's absolutely correct, and that we're not ruling out people, but I think where there is a little bit of hole at the moment is the ability to stand outside your SDLC, be able to continuously monitor the signals and give you that holistic picture, whether you are a developer, whether you're an AppSec owner, you're a service owner, or a auditor, even second line of defense. Can I get real-time view into that artifact that's just dropped into production, which kind of segues us into compliance, right? But so what we do not want an organization to do is do one thing for the internal security and then repeat that whole shebang again for externals compliance, right? So you need something in place that's doing security and compliance in tandem, right? Because they're two sides to the same coin. So what are your thoughts about, because this is, what are your thoughts on that is based on your experience, Ken? The evidencing part of compliance, right? How do you see compliance against security assurance, and how do you compare that in most organizations that you've seen? Do they work in tandem or not?
That's probably one of the biggest challenges I see is they work independently. But to what Tracy was saying earlier, this should be embedded throughout the whole life cycle, from the far left to the far right, all embedded together and interrelated. If you're doing security separate from compliance, you're neither secure nor compliant because you've got gaps.
Yes.
And I think that's where a lot of companies make a mistake. They get their security experts in, and they've got their niche, and they've got the compliance experts with their niche. But when you put everyone in a room together, they get a different perspective. When they hear the developer's point of view and the ops point of view, they understand why things are the way they are. They then begin to cross-pollinate. Well, here's how you can secure what you're doing. And this is how, through automation and by making it part of the entire life cycle, compliance is baked in. It's just what we do, and it's not a bolt-on or extra work. Tracy, I know you've got a lot of thoughts in this area.
No, I do, but you're doing a fantastic job. It's all about shifting everywhere. I don't like the term shift left. I understand where it came from and why, but it's like testing. We don't just shift it left, we shift it ubiquitously, right? We test ubiquitously. Security needs to be ubiquitous, a part of a fabric of everything that we're doing. So no, you're spot on. The hard part often is where to get started, especially if all of our software is not greenfield. I work in a world where some of it's brownfield. It could be decades old. Even in some of the commercial stuff that I have done, they have decades of software. Where do they pick? Which thing are they going to automate? How do they apply DevSecOps? Where do they go after that? And if you have brownfield, right, which means it's pre-existing, it's vintage, doesn't have to be decades old. It could be last year, and it could have been done without the same security that you would want for something that's greenfield. And then you have the integration, right? Brownfield and greenfield makes kind of a nice olive color, and that's a lot of what we do as well. So we have to be very specific. I find that the number one challenge is looking at the architecture and understanding, is it atomic enough that I can do this? Because applying all of these tools, all of these practices, all of these capabilities to a supersized monolith might not be effective. I may need to refactor that. Now, there are smaller monoliths, and Amazon is doing some pretty interesting things with minifying, right, these monoliths. So there just happen to be all one code bundle for effective deployment. Think of it like embedded software, software that's directly going onto hardware, not a cloud-based application. So there's, if I'm not able to break down so that I'm able to do that type of scanning. It's like putting, I jokingly say this all the time, it's like taking a steel girder and trying to put it through a wood chipper. All it's going to do is break the machine. So we need to take a step back oftentimes and understand, where can I apply it? Do I need to refactor? If I can refactor, what is the cost of that, and how do I start to apply this to it? So many different roles and responsibilities and different challenges. It all comes back to and everybody hates this, but I'll say it. It depends. What's your context? Where are you at? What are your policies? What is the, what umbrella do you live under? What type of software? What domain are you in? All of those things together start to give us a picture.
So I think participant 889, DevOps is a great process for maintaining SDLC. Security and monitoring is always concerned at all aspects. Yes, absolutely. That is absolutely spot on. The thing I want to go back to, though, is one size will never fit everybody. That's a given. Whether that's a brownfield, greenfield, all of those points you make are valid. But you have to start somewhere where you have the whole organization has a collective understanding on what does good look like in this sector. What define good for define your own objectives, sticking with the principle of agile, sticking with the principle of DevOps, empower the teams to define their own standards. It has to be, it has to be in line with some of the regulatory obligations. But if you have to start somewhere where the team has the capability, visibility of the current state, powered by real-time information, hooks into all of the tooling, and actionable insights to all of these people, personas, right? Because everybody's coming at the same problem from a different angle. So for example, I met somebody this week at the AWS summit where he said, we've got the best tooling in the world and our DevSecOps really works. But where we fall short is every time I have to send an artifact to production, my entire team loses half a day. And if it's a 70 dev losing half a day because they're all going off collecting Confluence screenshots and PDFs to put into some arcade system that they've got, that adds up. So, the number that came up was something like 100K, 150 USD typically per application. And a large organization can have up to 500 to 1,000 applications. Cost adds up, right? So so if you're doing security, if you've done DevSecOps to the point where you've really empowered your team to get visibility of what the security posture is going to look like, you should be automating this part as well, because you're doing all the right things. So where is the hang up there? Why is the evidence part still so challenging for people when the auditors turn up?
I think part of that really comes back to a bit of an incongruence between the tooling and the process. And for a lot of teams, they also have that added layer of unrealistic expectations. Things have to ship fast, not good, not right, not accurate. And so things become a lot of half measures. Automation becomes extra work. Security layering in, more work. Architecture, coming back to something Tracy said, I see a lot of teams skip that whole step altogether. And then it's like saying, I want to go on a trip and see Europe, but I don't want to use a map. And so when you combine all of those things together, trying to unify it with no sense of direction is really a painful, overwhelming experience. If they start small, iterative development, even with security, don't start with 100 tools and turn them all on. Get one working right, get the right signals, then add the next layer as it makes sense. Find those parts of your process that are painful and automate them. And find those parts of the process that are wrong and fix them, even if it means we need to stop for a moment. Because if you don't fix those foundational aspects, you get that continuous grinding. I love the metaphor. You get the girder going into the wood chipper.
A couple of things popped into my mind as you were saying that. in starting out, one of the things that you need to do is if your organization is starting out on this journey, there has to be that strong leadership buy-in and understanding. Leadership cannot simply say, we're going to do Agile and we're going to get cloud and do some DevOps. There has to be a true understanding and a strong conviction. You mentioned earlier, Ken, that you need it from the bottom up. So we need to make sure that there's education all the way around. But if you're just starting out, I don't think that you should start with a massive scale out. Start small, start with a pilot. And when it comes to that pilot, when you are finished with that pilot, don't do what the majority of organizations do, which is, okay, let's scale that. Because when you do a pilot, you're trying something for the very first time. You're doing the minimum viable to get across whatever finish line you have. You are waiving policy. You are making decisions. People are sleeping under the desk because this is so exciting and they're working so hard at it. Pilots are by nature Herculean to get to the end of it. So once you get that success, whatever success looks like, once you get there, then sustain it for a bit, just a little bit, and understand this policy, we actually need to change our corporate policy. We need to train people in this thing. So use that as an experiment before you try to scale. Because what I see happening is people do a pilot. The pilot sounds great. They've got some automations. Now everybody go and do it. And it grinds to a halt. It absolutely fails. So success, then sustain it before you ever start to scale. Those basics and the focus on de-risking all of the time, I think will help people to get after this a little bit better.
Right. So we need to move to another topic now, because here's the deal, right? We can't talk about security these days. How many, without talking about open source vulnerabilities, supply chain vulnerabilities, how many here, or I am not talking to a large audience here, but have any of you lived through the Log4j? Have you been a developer in the Log4j era? And you just have to go back to that nightmare to understand the importance of keeping an eye on supply chain vulnerabilities. It's a hot thing, right? I read a statistic somewhere. It's increased 50% in the last 2 years, the compromises in supply chain that's resulted in, huge, high profile breaches. So this is a hot topic right now. And there are many toolings out there, but I'd like to get your thoughts on what is effective in supply chain vulnerability management specifically.
From my perspective, what I see that really makes teams succeed is when it, again, is a practice level decision. By that, I mean, what is our policy around updating our supply chain? How often do we review that? Are we using automated tools to look for vulnerabilities? So we might even move that faster as things are discovered. I see a number of teams that will invest in a new tool to, as part of their automation, scan during the CI process or the CD process. But they're not doing the continuous monitoring. I did it at build time. If once it's out in production, if it becomes insecure, that's a different team's problem. They're not doing it at dev time either. Almost every major platform, Node, NPM, TypeScript, JavaScript, Java, Python, .NET, comes with a tooling that will tell you what's the current state of your supply chain. Do you have packages that are out of date or vulnerable? I would say that in my experience, less than 10% of the development teams I've talked to use that during dev to make decisions. They wait till CI, and very rarely do they scan after deployment. And so I think it has to be thought of as a holistic thing, to what Tracy was saying earlier. Shift everywhere, not just a point solution.
I think we can't have a conversation about supply chain without mentioning SBOM though. I mean,
yes.
you can't, there has to be a practice of maintaining SBOMs. And, it's not just about what's in your code. It's about your direct and transitive dependencies that are used while building your artifacts, right? And if Log4j was to happen today, there's enough tooling out there where I could go in, put Log4j package version, and get a list of applications and repositories that are vulnerable in production, right? But how many companies actually have, let's say, salsa level 1 or salsa level 2 that forces you to generate an SBOM and provenance of build artifacts?
I can say that in the government space and the United States, there have been mandates for that, and those have been industry has pushed back against it, and for some good reason. One of the arguments against giving an SBOM is that I'm giving you essentially the recipe of everything that I do, and therefore it might make me more insecure. The second aspect of that is, if I give it to you, you're using whether it's open source or whether it is something you've purchased from me, are you able to keep that secure, the SBOM secure? So there's some interesting nuanced conversations that are happening with that. We've moved from a mandate for SBOM. It has been reduced or watered down in some areas to be what's called attestation, where I'm not actually giving you a VEX or I'm not actually giving you a document, right? I'm not giving it to you electronically in quite the same way. I'm giving you an attestation that says, I'm not going to give you the recipe, but I will promise you that it has been done that way.
Yeah.
The SBOMs are a bit of a Band-Aid, though. And the reason I say that is that we have to make decisions on ownership and accountability. So if you're using open source, is that a well-funded open source project? What's the community like for that? If there is a vulnerability, is there a maintainer? Is there somebody there to fix it? Or do you have people invested within your organization who are contributors to it? So it enters into another interesting dichotomy. Many organizations are takers, they're users of open source, and they don't necessarily give back into the open source community. There is a company that I'm very much a fan of, this interesting model. They will work with you to determine your dependencies, Ken. So like you said, a lot of organizations don't even know their dependencies. They will work with you to understand those, and they will actually be monitoring for any vulnerabilities in that open source. And they have paid maintainers. So they are acting, so you could subscribe to them, and they are watching, not all of your open source, obviously, that could be horrendous and tremendous, but you pick it based on where your risks are. So quite an interesting approach to it. I have a love-hate with SBOMs because they seem too little, too late. We talked about them 10 years ago, 15 years ago, and I don't understand. Log4j just made them trendy and exciting and necessary.
I think the big challenge with open source vulnerabilities, like something like Log4j, is not fixing, because fixing is 4 lines of code, but gauging the blast radius of exposure at an organization level when you've got 500 applications and you want to get your team to fix the problem. You have no idea which application is using what, and that's where SBOM comes in, because you cannot take somebody's service and expect to turn this around in a week, right? You need an up-to-date bill of material that includes those dependencies, so you can just go put it into a graph database and say search, right? And then the fixing part was easy. I think I read somewhere, there's a federal statistics, I think. They said 33,000 hours were spent gauging SBOM impact across divisions. Collective man hours, which is insane when you think about it, right? So SBOM ticks that box. It's just, I think more companies need to adopt that practice. We can't close this topic without talking about AI, right? It's everywhere. Everybody wants to talk about AI. But I can see some really interesting use cases in security and compliance. I'd like to hear your thoughts on what you see, how you see AI impacting this space.
And I think AI brings a whole new angle to all of this, because once you introduce AI, you're now introducing all kinds of new code, but you've got to weigh the productivity trade-off with some understanding of what the AI is bringing you. By that, I mean, I can ask it to write me code that does something, and it can be very effective given the right guidance. But we're still very early in that part of the curve of its development, where it can look at the broader context and make sure the code it's writing is secure, is performant, is best practice. Because AI is influenced today based on really two key things. Other code that it trained on,
Yeah.
which doesn't always follow security or best practices.
Correct.
And then on the other side of it, a lot of the AI is learning in real time from the rest of the code base surrounding the file you're creating. And so if you don't have those processes and best practices, it just got a lot of examples of how to implement code that follow your practice, but not necessarily align you to industry. So it's a powerful tool in the right context, but you have to understand the limitations, where its strengths are, and your responsibility for the resulting code.
Well, and it needs to be in the right hands. I will tell you right now that I won't let junior developers or new in career developers use it to generate any code. You know why? Because they're given 4 or 5 options so they can click through and pick which option that they want. And you know what they lack? Experience. It's not that they're never going to get it, but they lack the experience. So code's being generated that, to your point, is of lesser quality. As of the end of April, I believe the statistic was only 29% of generated code was deemed to be of quality enough to be able to be leveraged. So there are other places that we should and could be using it now. Use it to explain code. You're a new developer, take that.
Yep.
Make sure it's in your trusted environment. You're not logging into your ChatGPT or your CodePad. You're not logging into anybody else's place.
Yeah.
Make sure that within your organization, your understanding, use it to explain to you. Ask it where there are security flaws. Ask it to help you with those things, but don't ask it to generate. Not at this point. Come back to me in 6 months. I'll tell you about how things have been changing, but I'm a very staunch advocate that we limit that piece of it. There are tremendous things being done in security, though. If you're using, for example, you can do a threat modeling that's using GAN, which are the generative adversarial models. If you use what's called a 2GAN model, you've got one of the models that's trying to generate data that looks as real as possible. And then you have, I believe it's called the disruptor. It is trying to detect whether or not that data. So you've got 2 models feeding each other, coming up with some really interesting outlying threats. So there are some amazing, we could spend 3 days just talking about the possibility of how to apply this across the SDLC and how to apply it. Be safe. Make sure your organization understands you're using it. Do not go out and just start using it in your corporate environment without somebody knowing and being able to tell you yes or no. That follows our risk posture, because that's where we're getting leaks right now. There have been multiple corporations that have put their foot down because they have folks that are leaking their internal code out into the wild.
Yeah. So a couple of things I think spring to mind on the back of that. First is you need to have a governance policy in place. If you're introducing AI, you need to have AI governance, right? And that needs to be codified for sure, because you can't just do point in time. Secondly, I think AI in terms of, like you said, Tracy, explanation of maybe suggested code. It still needs to go through the same review process that normal code will go through. As long as AI cannot automatically insert code, it can suggest remediation or say, explain this vulnerability to me, right? What does the CVE 246 mean? That sort of thing inside your IDE or inside another tool that you're already using could give some kind of productivity gains. But then, like you say, that it has to be wrapped around with approval and protection in terms of review before it gets into your own SDLC workstream, I think.
Well, and I'll throw a nugget in there for you to think about, Gayatri. Where's SBOM in all of this? Because if I've pointed the learning models at open source, if I've pointed it at the repositories, the public repositories of the world, I've just lost provenance. I've just lost the lineage if the model is now generating something for me without saying, I got this from Mike, I got that from Tracy, I got that from over here.
But I have an answer for you. That's where real-time compliance and security comes in, because what I would expect if you have a tool that does it in real time is, as soon as your model has generated a new piece of code, that's gotten merged into the trunk branch, immediately you have got an updated SBOM, because now that SBOM, that artifact has changed. So the SBOM is updated, because SBOM point in time is worthless.
But it doesn't tell me, hold on, it doesn't tell me where it learned to provide that code from. So yes, I can say that came from Tracy's IDE, but what we don't have is where did that model grab onto that method, that class, that larger piece of code that it's now pushed forward. And it can be a direct copy of something that it's taken from. So we kind of have SBOM. We can have an entire conversation on this.
Yes, we'll have to. Well, this has been great. There's another question. I'm a QA lead collaborating on a daily basis with developers, UX, Scrum Master, Program Manager working on project for the government. I work closely with developers. Thank you. They're working on refactoring APIs, automate. We don't use AI due to governance. That's absolutely, I think most of the organizations fall under the same category. Sorry, I don't know your name, participant 178. I think there are very few organizations that are opening up, but I think they need to have a governance policy in place first. Otherwise, they could be inviting themselves some trouble. Having said that, Ken, I know we didn't mention, we said we wouldn't mention names, but I know we're working on some cool AI stuff. You guys are working on some cool AI stuff. I saw an announcement last week. So I don't think it's a wave we can resist. We need to learn to manage it. We need to build the guardrails, I think.
And to Tracy's point, if you're thinking of using it, one, start thinking governance now. By the time you want to use the tool, it's too late to start those discussions because it may take weeks, months, extreme cases, years to get through legal governance compliance. And then two, as you're looking at tools, understand what it does. To Tracy's point, does it work by sending things back and using it to train the next round? Well, that could be a leak. Does it utilize the data, but locally? That's a completely different scenario of using the models.
Yeah.
But you need to understand those trade-offs, what it's doing and how that aligns with your policy.
Yeah.
Right. And
So-
no matter what, well, Gayatri, one thing I'll say is no matter what, any organization should turn around right now and ask the members of the organization, pulse them, what are you using this right now? Because immediately today, organizations need to have an understanding of what their people are doing. They need to not be draconian about it, but it's very important to say, are you using it and understand? Because people have reasons that they're driven to it. So you want to understand where it has brought value into their days. At the same time, that's going to help you with your policy, the policy that Ken is talking about.
So we've got 3 minutes left. I need to make sure we've sent the key messages to our audience. Look, what we're saying is shift smart, right? It's not about shift left, shift smart. Shift security to the place in your SDLC that is most effective, accurate, and scalable, right? It's not just about tools, it's about people. Start from the beginning, get the right people, get the whole team in, plan security in right from the start. Make sure security is real time, compliance is real time, and you're not doing one thing for security, another thing for compliance, right? Drive efficiency so it becomes transparent to the development team and it's just there, right? Those are the key messages we want to send. Any other questions from anyone, please jump in. Otherwise, we are 2 minutes in to completion time. So thank you very much for your time, all the participants. Thank you, Ken. Thank you, Tracy. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you, and I look forward to seeing you in DevOps World. And we've got DevOps World 2023 happening in a week's time. We will be in New York. So I hope to see most of you guys. If you haven't registered yet, please do. And then additional DevOps World will be happening. Events will be happening all over the place. It'll be happening in Chicago, Santa Clara, Singapore, and be there because there'll be lots of cool stuff, lots of cool announcements happening in all of these events. So look forward to seeing you guys. Thank you very much for your time.
Awesome. Hey, Gayatri, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Yes, thank you so much for pitching out that DevOps World pitch for us. I do have that pinned to the top of the chat to anyone who is interested. Do feel free to click that link. You can check it out later, but click it now while you're here, while we've got you. So Gayatri, Tracy, and Ken, thank you all so much for joining us today. This last hour absolutely flew by, and there's just so many little nuggets hidden here and there. So this was such a great conversation. Thank you all so much.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
The 4 winners of our $25 Amazon gift card drawing are Emily S., Jose M., Sandra R., and David W. So to our 4 winners, keep an eye on your email for us. I'll be sending you an email shortly to figure out how to get that email or get that gift card to you. If you don't happen to see an email from me, check your spam folder on the off case that it happens to be filtered out. I'd like to thank CloudBees for sponsoring our program today. And again, to our audience, thank you so much for joining us. If you stick around for just one more minute, we'll redirect you to our post-webinar survey, and we'd love to hear your thoughts. Whether they are about today's program or any upcoming topics, please let us know in that survey. We do hope to see everyone at a future Techstrong Learning Experience. Have a great rest of your day, and you may now disconnect. Thanks again, everyone.
Thank you.